Hi there everyone, Mr. Lewis here, coming to you from my blank void of a home office because I'm currently under quarantine. So unfortunately, I won't be back to school until Tuesday, November 10th. Fortunately, I've had virtual students all year long, so this shouldn't be too much of a change from what you would normally see in the Buzz agenda each day. The big change is that instead of giving in-person lectures and going through the notes that way, obviously, we're going to have to do it through video. So I'm going to be creating these video lectures for each day to give you instructions, to give you new information, whatever it might be. I need your help, though, in really staying on top of your game in this class while I'm gone. So please make sure you're doing a great job of checking the Buzz agenda every single day and reading through in detail what I'm asking of you. It won't be too much, I promise you that, but we need to keep moving forward, and we need to make sure that we're staying on track, we're staying on pace as best we can while I'm gone. So with that said, let's jump into today's activities. Okay, so 3.3, elements of folk culture. Up to this point, we've been discussing mostly popular culture. Today, we dive deeper into folk culture, and some of the major differences between folk culture and popular culture lie in the hearths of those cultures. So a hearth is the origin, where something starts. And in folk cultures, it tends to be very mysterious. We have more anonymous hearths, whereas in pop culture, they're very easily traceable. People really want others to know that they're the ones who started a trend in pop culture, right? So a lot of pop culture stems from places in the United States or Western Europe. So Germany, France, Spain, England, those kind of places. Whereas folk culture tends to be in more isolated areas. And more isolated areas oftentimes are found in more underdeveloped countries because there's a better chance of being isolated. Now, getting into the material side of culture. Material culture, once again, are things like clothing, food, sports and leisure. We're going to look at all that stuff. Things that we can see, material culture. Starting with clothing. There are two major factors that influence the type of clothing worn in folk culture. One, the environment. Climate is a major factor in folk clothing. Why? Because they're living in some very extreme climates. They're isolated and therefore might not have access to all the same comforts that we do, even in a place where it gets very cold. It's quite cold today. So the difference is natural resources, local resources are used in building the clothing that they actually wear, or creating the clothing they actually wear. I said building because I'm looking at these wooden shoes. So in the Netherlands, the Dutch culture, oftentimes we see people wearing wooden shoes. And right now, it's kind of, we call these clogs. It's come down to where people think it's because of music. And clogging is certainly a type of dance, but it actually goes back to the climate. When the area was first settled, it was very wet and marshy. And they had to constantly dredge these marshes. And because of that, they were constantly working in wetlands. So wooden shoes were created because they were more practical working in that climate. In Arctic climates, on the other hand, you can see the photo up here, we have people wearing these fur-lined coats, right? Because that's available as a local resource, fur, and also other things that are found through hunting that might be used as lining in their coats. So the environment, the climate, plays a huge role in determining clothing. Also, religion. So you can see two pictures here. These are some young Jewish men, Orthodox Jewish men, and these are some Muslim women. And interestingly enough, they're actually very similar in what they're wearing. Over on the left, these men are wearing black suits with just a basic white shirt and a black hat covering their head. Over here, these women are wearing a black gown, right, covering their body, just like these men, and black hijab covering their head, just like these men. The big difference is they have a veil on, covering the rest of their face. But in both cases, it's about modesty. Okay, this goes back to religious custom with Orthodox Judaism and Islam. So in much of the Middle East, this is the clothing that's expected for women. loose fitting, covering the body, covering the head, and in some cases covering the face. Whereas in some cases, like with these men, it's simply wearing the black suit, white shirt, black hat. But in both cases, it really comes down to modesty. And so religion can play a huge role in determining the clothing that's found in folk culture. So environment, the climate, and religion are the two most important factors that we see with folk clothing. Sometimes we do see this commodified. So here's what this means. If somebody was wearing a particular clothing because that's what tourists expect to see, but once they're done at their day job, they don't really wear that clothing. They're wearing, say, Levi jeans and a Nike shirt. That's what we call commodification of culture. It's using that culture to make money, to sell tickets, to get people to travel to that area, whatever it might be. This is what we call commodification. So you can also look around the world and see where there are actually restrictions on women's dress. So I'm not going to go too deep into these maps. I think it's pretty interesting to look at, though, and you can look at what some of these laws entail. So it says where women's religious dress was restricted. So where women are actually being restricted from wearing certain religious garbs, right? Garments. So in 2012, 2013, this isn't going back that far, you can see Canada is the only country in North or South America to have any restriction on religious dress for women. You can also see that most of Europe has some restrictions on religious dress for women. Australia, China, India, only a few parts of Africa, some in the north, some in the east, and then Russia as well. So it kind of throws it off because Russia and Canada are so big, and China and Australia and India are so big. It makes it look like more countries actually have these restrictions than is really accurate. But you can see the individual countries down here, and there are quite a few. Don't get me wrong, but there are more countries that do not have restrictions on religious dress for women than do. So even with that said, women are still harassed in a lot of countries for wearing religious dress, and you can see not much of the Middle East or Africa because in a lot of those areas it's just expected, right? But in some areas like China, which is communist and has been very anti-religion for a long, long time, it makes sense. It's a little more believable that women would be harassed there. When you look at Canada, it's a bit surprising, but they have had some issues with that up north. Where women's religious dress was required, so it's actually through local law required or through local customs required, you can see in some parts of northern and eastern Africa, and then into the Arabian Peninsula, into the Middle East, over into Southeast Asia, really Indonesia, and Russia as well, but not many, right? There are not many countries listed here when it comes to religious dress being required. And then where women were harassed for not wearing religious dress, a lot of those countries are the same as the previous map we just saw, because if it's required and women aren't wearing what's supposedly required of them, then they might be harassed based on that. But it's interesting to see how religion and law and local customs play a role in what women are allowed to wear or supposed to wear. So, moving on to food. We've got our clothing, now we're eating. So a lot of folk food customs or behaviors are especially grounded in the environment. So the environment, the local resources determine a lot about what people can actually get their hands on to eat, right? And interestingly enough, the local environment can play a huge role in determining taste and flavors. So when the local environment really creates a specific type of taste for that food, this is what we call terroir. So it's this this French term, silent R at the end, terroir, and it means that there's something about the soil or the ecosystem, the topography and ecology of that area that are really creating a unique taste. So this is folk food culture, right? And it's interesting because then people will pay big bucks to get their hands on a particular type of cheese or a particular type of wine because it has that terroir, it has that specific flavor that you can't find anywhere else. So there are also some taboos associated with food, right? There's some foods that you're just not supposed to eat based on local custom, based on local law, whatever it might be. Taboos are restrictions on behavior. So it could be a social restriction, it's just socially seen as taboo, or it could be religious law that's making it taboo. But a taboo is a behavior that is highly frowned upon. You're not supposed to do it. So, for example, hunting an endangered species would be considered taboo, and people would go after you on social media, right? If you were stupid enough to post that picture after hunting an endangered species, but some people do. And so these taboos can carry a lot of weight. Socially, you might be vilified. Religiously, you might be vilified. And of course, nobody wants either of those two things. So here are some common taboos. In Judaism, people are supposed to follow kosher laws. So Jews who do follow kosher laws can only eat the meat of animals that chew their cud or that have cloven hooves. So you're not supposed to eat pigs in Judaism because pigs do have cloven hooves, but they don't chew their cud. So in Islam, okay, there's a taboo against pork. And really, you guys, it says these things. It says these things in the religious works, the religious writings of these groups, right? So in the Quran, for example, there is a passage that just says you're not supposed to eat swine. You're not supposed to eat pork. So in some ways, it is just written right into the religion. However, after a while, it becomes just a custom, right? It just becomes this behavior. Whether people remember why or not, taboos can carry a lot of weight and be very powerful. And if you fall outside that behavior, it can have huge consequences for you. And so in Hinduism, for example, there's a restriction on eating beef. Do some Hindus eat beef? Sure, of course, but it's taboo. And really, if you were to ask somebody who is following Hindu to the letter of the law, then they would tell you no beef. But of course, we all fall out of these taboos here and there. So you also see how these taboos are sort of accounted for, or how local taste is accounted for as you look throughout the world. In McDonald's, they have kosher McDonald's in places like Israel, right, where Judaism is very common. There are kosher McDonald's. You also see some of these fast food chains changing up their styles to account for the local folk culture, the trends and taste of that culture. So this is a Burger King burger in Japan where they actually dyed the cheese and the sauce and the bun black. And they use squid ink to do this. So it's kind of interesting going above and beyond to appeal to those local flavors. Now, you can also see how hunting for food changed up a little bit between folk culture and pop culture. So let's just take the bison, for example. In folk culture, Native American cultures, bison was hunted for meat, for clothing, for shelter, for tools, for a water bottle or a water carrier. And wasting any part of the bison was seen as taboo. You weren't supposed to do that. It was a waste, right? But in pop culture, we saw European settlers and their descendants in America hunting bison almost to extinction, right? So we drove a lot of bison out by hunting and hunting and hunting them. And fortunately, we've been able to bring them back, but they were almost extinct. Well, they were only using them for the skins, like for decoration or trendiness or fashion, and the tongues, because the tongues were so fatty, they were a delicacy. And oftentimes, the rest of the bison was just left there to waste. And in Native American culture, that would have been considered very taboo. So, folk housing. Let's move on to housing. Speaking of the bison, a lot of times their skin were used to make teepees. Right, in Native American culture, they used the skin of bison. They would sew them all together, get a bunch of them, and that eventually became the canvas for the outside of a tent. So the types of building materials used to construct folk housing are often available in the environment, like the bison. But the two most common are wood and brick, because they can be used, or gathered, I should say, pretty easily in the local environment. Brick, you're putting together whatever kind of clay you can create, right? In some cases, it's stronger than others, but wood is from trees. So these are the two most commonly found building materials in the entire world because they're easily accessible in folk culture. However, sometimes they're not. So for example, in hot climates, in arid, dry climates, you might not have many trees, right? So you might not have much wood. So you see a lot of flat roofs in hot climates. They don't have the wood needed to build a big roof, right? A pitched roof, like an A-frame. So instead, you see a flat roof. And also, it tends to create more shade, right, around the entire area. And but a big part of that is they just don't have access to that wood. Also in hot climates, you're not going to have a lot of precipitation. There's not a lot of rain or snow, right? So you don't have it all building on top of your flat roof and then caving in. But in areas that do have a lot of wet or snowy times of year, they do need a pitched roof, an angled roof, so that it all falls off. So as we start getting snow into the winter here, if we had a flat roof, that thing would cave in. That snow gets very, very heavy, and we can't have it just building up on top. It needs to fall off at some point. Some people even go so far as to, even with a pitched roof, with an angled roof, they still get the snow off there because they're worried about the weight of it. So in temperate climates, you often have people trying to get southern-facing windows to help with the temperature in that home. So you can see some houses here in Oman and some in Estonia. In Oman, we've got some flat roofs, and in Estonia, we've got pitched roofs, right? Well, if you look at where these two countries are located, that makes sense. Oman is down here in the Arabian Peninsula. It's a desert. They're not getting a lot of precipitation, right? In Estonia, on the other hand, they're way up here, up near Scandinavia, so they're going to get tons and tons and tons of snow. Finally, folk music. So we're getting into the recreation side of folk culture here. Much like clothing, food, and housing, folk music is determined by the environment. It's influenced by the environment, agriculture, right? Farming, the land, as well as climate. So it could be a song that's asking for rain, praying for rain, because the local people need it for their crops that year. But it could come in other formats as well. So we see a lot of folk songs that also convey rites of passage, life cycle events, things like birth, death, marriage, all these big events that we celebrate in our lives. There's a folk song to go with it, but they don't sing it until that event comes up. It's very special, right, in that sense. We also see how agriculture can be connected through a Vietnamese type of music that I'm going to show you in a second. So in Vietnam, a lot of people are subsistence farmers. They are living off of the land that they farm. And so what they've done throughout the years is use this type of music called Quan Ho to actually pass along tips and technology associated with farming. They're passing along farming strategies and techniques. And so I've got a short video here just to show you what this sounds like and what this ritual looks like. And you can see all the spectators who are wearing normal, typical clothing like we might see, pop culture clothing. So it's to honor this this song, right? This history, this part of Vietnamese history. So they're putting on the show now to honor their ancestors and their culture. But long ago, it was actually used to pass along these tips and tricks of the trade for farmers. Pretty incredible stuff and quite beautiful. So moving along, very last thing here is folk leisure. So what do people do in their free time when it comes to folk culture? And sports, just like every other culture, are a common answer to that. But the most popular sport throughout the entire world also traces back to folk culture, and that's soccer, often called football in other parts of the world. Soccer started in England. It was a folk custom in England about 1,000 years ago. And as England started to branch out, and as the British Empire became more and more dominant over the course of hundreds of years, they took this sport with them. And it's such an easy thing to pick up. Not everyone's good at it, of course, but all you need is a ball and a couple goals, right? And so it caught on very, very quickly. It diffused very quickly through relocation migration. As people from England or the British Empire spread throughout the rest of the world, they took this game with them and they taught others how to play it. And today, it is the most popular sport in the entire world, just not in the United States. So, that's it for section 3.3. If you want to watch something interesting, you can see how this particular culture tests the strength and the manliness of their young men as they approach adulthood by taking the bullet ant test. Basically, they have to put on these giant gloves, you see them right here, that are filled with what they call bullet ants. Ants that sting you and cause about 30 times as much pain as a bee sting with each one. And they have to hold it on their hands for 10 minutes, and it continues to hurt for about 24 hours after. An interesting video. It's only 4 minutes long. Highly recommend you watch that if you have some time today. All I'm asking you to do with this section of notes today is to complete the 3.3 checkpoint in Buzz. It's only 10 questions. It's multiple choice. You have unlimited attempts, and you can use the notes to kind of work your way through it. So I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be able to get a 10 out of 10 after at least maybe a couple tries. But if you're finding yourself doing it 4 or 5 times and you're still not getting that 10 out of 10, shoot me an email and tell me which questions you're missing. It could be a mistake that I've made, or it might just need a little bit of an explanation to get you back on the right track. All right, everyone. Thank you for all the work that I know you'll do this week, and please reach out if there are any issues or concerns. And please be kind and respectful to our substitute for the week. I know you will. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you later.